Imagine being turned away from your own company simply because of how you look. What would you do? The automatic glass doors slid open with a quiet hiss, letting in the late morning sunlight. Outside, the downtown streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, buzzed with their usual weekday rush. Coffee in one hand, phone in the other, people moving with purpose. Inside, however, the atmosphere was different. Sleek, modern and controlled, the lobby of Grayson and Whitmore Consulting carried an air of quiet sophistication. Polished marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and the faint aroma of fresh espresso drifted from a high-end coffee station tucked in the corner. The kind of place where first impressions mattered. And that was exactly why Elliot Grayson had chosen to show up unannounced. Dressed in dark slacks and a crisp navy polo, Elliot stepped inside, taking in the space that, as of 3 weeks ago, legally belonged to him. He had poured years of sweat and sacrifice into his company, Grayson Holdings, and acquiring this firm had been one of his biggest moves yet. Yet, as he stood in the grand lobby of his newest asset, there was no fanfare, no eager welcome, just a receptionist at the front desk who barely looked up. "Good morning," Elliot said as he approached. The woman behind the desk, Madeline Connors, barely lifted her eyes from her screen. Mid-50s, sharp features, blonde bob neatly curled inward. The kind of receptionist who had seen it all and didn't have the patience for what she assumed was another unsolicited visitor. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, still typing. Elliot's lips twitched in amusement. "Not exactly, but I do have business here." That got her attention. She finally looked up, scanning him up and down, and her expression shifted ever so slightly. There was something in her eyes, mild suspicion, maybe even irritation. "Sir, we don't allow walk-ins. If you're looking for job applications, you can visit our website." Elliot raised an eyebrow, more intrigued than offended. "Job applications?" She exhaled, already reaching for a small, laminated card from a stack on her desk. "Yes, we're not accepting in-person submissions. If you're here to drop off a resume, I can't take it. Everything is online now." Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not here for a job." Madeline's expression didn't change. If anything, her lips pressed tighter. She was already done with this conversation. "Then what exactly is your business here?" she asked, tone clipped. For a second, Elliot debated telling her outright, dropping the bombshell that he now owned this entire company, that he was technically her boss. But there was something almost entertaining about watching her assume. "I'd like to take a look around," he said simply. Madeline scoffed before she could stop herself. "Sir, this is a professional environment. You can't just walk in off the street." Now that caught his attention. He held her gaze, his amusement fading just slightly. "And what makes you think I walked in off the street?" Madeline blinked, suddenly realizing how that sounded. She hesitated, but rather than backtrack, she doubled down. "We have policies, sir. No unscheduled visitors. If you don't have an appointment, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Elliot stayed silent for a moment, studying her. Employees shuffled past in the background, a few glancing over, sensing the tension, but none stopping to intervene. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the space. "Oh my God, Mr. Grayson." A young executive, early 30s, sharp suit, name badge flashing, Owen Lancaster, hurried over, his expression shifting from confusion to outright panic. Madeline frowned, glancing between the two men. "Wait, what?" But it was too late. The weight of her mistake was already sinking in, and the silence in the lobby stretched just a little too long. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the lobby was thick, hanging in the air like an invisible force. Owen Lancaster, still catching his breath from his hurried approach, looked between Elliot and Madeline, his face shifting rapidly from confusion to something dangerously close to horror. "Mr. Grayson, I didn't know you were stopping by today." His voice was careful, polite, but laced with unmistakable panic. Elliot turned to him with a casual nod. Didn't think I needed an appointment to visit my own company. Owen swallowed hard. Madeline, on the other hand, had gone completely still. Elliot could see the realization sinking into her features, the way her eyes flickered, the way her posture stiffened. She still wasn't saying anything, but she didn't need to. Wait a second, she finally muttered, looking at Owen. He's... him. Owen didn't even glance at her. Yes. It was a simple answer, but the weight of it was crushing. Madeline's fingers twitched slightly on the desk. Just minutes ago, she had spoken to Elliot with sharp authority, assuming he was someone who didn't belong. Now, her entire demeanor was shifting. Elliot watched the transformation in real time. The stiff spine, the clipped voice, they were gone. What remained was a woman suddenly desperate to save face. "Mr. Grayson," she started, her tone different now, softer, even polite. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding." Elliot tilted his head slightly, studying her. A misunderstanding. She nodded quickly, hands folded in front of her now. "Yes, of course. I didn't recognize you, that's all. If I had known..." "If you had known... what exactly?" His voice was calm, measured, but everyone in earshot could feel the tension woven into the words. Madeline hesitated, clearly scrambling for the right thing to say. Owen shifted uncomfortably beside her, fully aware of how bad this looked. A few employees had stopped in the distance, pretending not to eavesdrop. Phones were out, text messages already flying across departments. Elliot let the silence stretch for a few seconds before he spoke again. "Tell me something," he said, voice level. "What about me made you so sure I didn't belong here?" Madeline opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She knew exactly what he was asking. Her silence was answer enough. Owen cleared his throat, stepping in. "Mr. Grayson, I can personally assure you that this is not how we typically treat visitors." Elliot gave him a dry look. "You sure about that?" Owen hesitated, because the truth was he couldn't be sure. And everyone standing there knew it. But Madeline wasn't done trying to fix what was already shattered. I was just following protocol." The words came out fast, like she was grasping at a lifeline. "We have rules about security. We don't just let people in off the street." That word again. Street. Elliot let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. "You don't even hear yourself, do you?" Madeline paled. She knew deep down that this wasn't just a simple policy issue anymore. But before she could say another word, the elevator doors behind them opened, and a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Elliot!" Heads turned as Graham Walters, one of the senior partners at the firm, stepped out. A tall man in his early 60s, white hair neatly combed back, dressed in an expensive three-piece suit. His expression was one of pure delight, completely unaware of the storm that had already hit the lobby. "I had no idea you were coming by today." He strode forward with open arms, a broad smile stretching across his face. "What a great surprise." Elliot returned the smile, but there was something behind his eyes that Graham missed completely. "Figured I'd drop in," Elliot said, voice smooth. "Wanted to see the place for myself." Graham clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Absolutely. You should have told me. I would have had a tour lined up." Elliot let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, I already got a welcome." And the way he said it. Even Graham caught the shift in tone. His eyes flickered toward Madeline, who was standing there, visibly uncomfortable, hands now clasped so tightly they were turning white. "Something wrong?" Graham asked, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to Madeline, watching her carefully. And then, he asked the question that would haunt her for a long time. Tell me, Ms. Connors, if I hadn't owned this company, would you have treated me the same way? The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of Elliot's questions sat heavy in the space between them. Madeline's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She had no good answer. Because any response, any excuse, would only make things worse. Graham Walters shifted his attention between Elliot and the now visibly shaken receptionist. The warmth that had been in his eyes moments ago was gone, replaced with something more measured. He wasn't a fool. He could sense the tension, the unspoken words hanging between them. Ms. Connors? His voice was even, but there was an edge to it. Madeline swallowed hard. She was trapped. She could feel the eyes on her, employees lingering nearby, watching from behind their desks, pretending to work, but hanging on to every second of this moment. It wasn't just about Elliot anymore. It was about what she had represented in those few minutes before the truth unraveled. She licked her lips, choosing her next words carefully. I never meant to be disrespectful, she said finally, forcing a tight smile. I was just doing my job. Elliot let out a quiet breath, shaking his head. You're still saying that, he murmured. Even now. The disappointment in his voice stung more than anger ever could. Owen Lancaster rubbed a hand over his jaw, like he wanted to disappear. The tension was suffocating, and Graham Walters could see it too. He knew this wasn't something that could be brushed under the rug. So he turned to Elliot. Come with me to my office, he said, his tone shifting. Let's talk. But Elliot didn't move. Why? Graham frowned slightly. I just think. No, tell me why. Elliot's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. Because you think this will go away if we just take it behind closed doors. More silence. Madeline's face burned. She wished she could vanish right then and there. But she was frozen, stuck in a mess of her own making. Elliot exhaled, finally stepping back. I don't need to go to your office, Graham. He gestured around. Everything I need to know is right here. Owen tensed beside them, knowing this was a disaster unfolding in real time. Graham, to his credit, tried to keep control of the moment. Elliot, let's be reasonable. Reasonable. Elliot let out a short laugh. You're worried about reasonable. Me? He glanced around the lobby, shaking his head. Let's be real, Graham. If I was anyone else today, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. The truth of that statement hit hard. The few employees still hovering quickly turned back to their desks. They didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. Graham hesitated, then sighed. He knew Elliot was right. And Madeline, she knew it too. Her hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to say something, anything, that would fix this. But there was nothing left to say. Elliot took a slow step closer to the desk, lowering his voice just enough that only Madeline and Graham could hear. What's worse, Madeline? That you made the wrong assumption? Or that you can't even admit why? Her face went pale. The question lingered, cutting through the last shreds of her composure, and Elliot didn't wait for an answer. He turned, walking past Graham, past Owen, past the watching eyes that quickly darted away when he met them. He didn't need to raise his voice to leave an impact, because the damage had already been done. The silence in the lobby was absolute, but before Elliot reached the elevators, he stopped. Slowly, he turned back toward Graham. Fix this, he said simply. Or I will. Graham nodded stiffly. He understood the weight of that statement. And with that, Elliot stepped into the elevator, watching as the doors slid shut. The elevator ride up was quiet. Elliot leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his mind replaying the events of the last 10 minutes. It hadn't been surprising. Disappointing? Yes. Frustrating? Absolutely. But surprising? No. Because he had seen it before. People who judged first and asked questions later. Who made assumptions the moment they saw someone like him walk through the doors of a place they never imagined he could own. The difference? This time, he had the power to do something about it. The elevator chimed as it reached the top floor. The doors slid open to reveal the executive suite, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Cincinnati, sleek modern furniture, a quiet, almost sterile atmosphere. As he stepped out, he was met by Alicia Reynolds, his new chief of operations. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, braided hair neatly pulled back, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. She had been one of his first hires after acquiring the company, a no-nonsense professional who knew how to handle business. She took one look at his face and let out a quiet sigh. "I take it the welcome committee wasn't what you expected." Elliot let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "You could say that." Alicia pursed her lips, already sensing what had happened. "Madeline? Madeline?" Alicia muttered something under her breath. Not surprised either. She gestured toward his office. "You want me to handle it?" Elliot considered it. He trusted Alicia completely. She would handle this situation better than anyone. But this wasn't just about Madeline. It was about everything she represented. "No," he said after a moment. "I'll do it myself." Alicia nodded, stepping aside as Elliot entered his office. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in natural light, but at that moment, all he cared about was the folder sitting on his desk. Inside was everything he needed to know about Grayson and Whitmore's internal culture. Hiring patterns, promotion history, employee complaints. Things that didn't always make it to the surface, but spoke volumes. And what he saw? It only confirmed what he already knew. The bias wasn't just at the front desk. It ran deeper. Alicia spoke up. "I had HR pull the numbers last week. Promotions, pay disparities, hiring trends. Let's just say, there's a pattern." Elliot exhaled slowly, closing the folder. He wasn't going to just make an example out of one receptionist. He was going to rebuild the entire foundation. And this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, down in the lobby, the air was thick with discomfort. Madeline sat stiffly at her desk, staring straight ahead, her hands folded tightly. Employees still passed by, but the energy in the room had shifted. She could feel their glances, hear the whispers. Her world, the one where she had unquestioned authority over who did and didn't belong in this building, had suddenly cracked wide open. Owen Lancaster stood nearby, pretending to check his phone, but really he was just avoiding the awkwardness. And Graham Walters. He was standing in the corner, deep in thought. This wasn't just about Elliot anymore. This was about the kind of company they had been running. The kind of company that was about to change, whether they were ready or not. And then the phone on Madeline's desk rang. She jumped slightly before answering, voice tight. "Front desk." A pause. And then Alicia Reynolds's calm but firm voice came through the receiver. "Ms. Connors, Mr. Grayson would like to see you in his office, now." Madeline's fingers clenched around the phone receiver. "Now?" she echoed, though she already knew the answer. "Now." Alicia's voice was steady, giving no room for argument. Madeline swallowed hard and set the phone down with shaky hands. This was it. As she stood, she could feel the weight of every glance in the room. People pretending not to notice, but they did. They all did. She smoothed her blouse, squared her shoulders, and made her way toward the elevators. Her heels clicked against the polished floors, each step heavier than the last. The ride up was agonizingly slow. When the doors finally opened, Alicia was waiting just outside, arms crossed. She didn't say a word, just gestured toward the office down the hall. Madeline hesitated. She wanted to turn back. but she forced herself to move forward. Inside, Elliot was seated behind his desk, hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. The city skyline stretched out behind him, sunlight pouring into the room, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. "Have a seat," he said. Madeline obeyed, placing her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. For a long moment, he just studied her. She hated the silence, hated how exposed she felt. "Do you understand why you're here?" he asked finally. She exhaled slowly. "Because I misjudged you." Elliot leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "Misjudged me?" Madeline pressed her lips together, then tried again. "I made an assumption that I shouldn't have." Elliot nodded slightly. "And what assumption was that?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to say it was just a mistake, just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't fly. "I assumed you weren't someone important," she admitted, voice quieter now. Elliot tilted his head slightly. "Not someone important." She winced at the way he repeated it. "And if I hadn't been the owner," he continued, his voice measured, "would we be having this conversation at all?" Madeline's stomach twisted, because the answer was no. If he had been just another visitor, just another man she decided didn't belong, this moment wouldn't exist. He would have left. Security might have been called, and she wouldn't have given it another thought. Elliot could see the realization on her face. "Ms. Connors, let's be clear about something," he said, his voice firm now. "This isn't just about me. It's about how many people have walked through that front door and been met with the same treatment." Madeline swallowed hard, because she knew it wasn't the first time. Elliot exhaled, tapping his fingers against the desk. "Here's what's going to happen." She tensed. "You're being placed on immediate leave while we conduct a review of your interactions with employees and visitors." Her heart dropped. "Wait, No." His voice was sharp, cutting through her protest before it even formed. "This isn't up for debate. I don't need an apology. I need accountability." She clenched her fists. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend herself, but deep down, she knew she had no defense. Elliot sighed, shaking his head. "The way you treat people when you think no one is watching, that's the real you." Madeline's breath caught. She had nothing left to say. Alicia stepped forward from where she had been standing quietly by the door. "You'll receive formal notice from HR. Please pack up your things before you leave today." Madeline rose from the chair on unsteady legs. She had walked into this building so sure of her authority. Now, she was walking out with none. As she reached the door, Elliot's voice stopped her one last time. "And Madeline?" She turned hesitantly. "Next time you assume someone doesn't belong." He met her eyes, steady and unwavering. "Ask yourself why." She had no response. Without another word, she walked out. As the door clicked shut behind her, Alicia let out a breath. That was overdue. Elliot didn't respond right away. He turned his chair slightly, gazing out over the city. This wasn't just about one person. This was about changing the culture. He reached for the folder on his desk, flipping it open again. There was work to do, policies to rewrite, training programs to implement, a company to rebuild, not just in numbers, but in values. Alicia crossed her arms. "You really think she'll reflect on what happened?" Elliot considered that for a moment. "That's on her," he said finally. "What matters is making sure this doesn't happen again." Alicia nodded. They both knew this was just the beginning. Down in the lobby, the atmosphere had shifted. The employees who had witnessed the incident weren't just going to forget it. And that was the point. Change doesn't happen in silence. It happens in moments like these, when the things that have been ignored for too long finally come to light. Elliot wasn't here to just own a company. He was here to change it. How often do we make assumptions about people based on appearances? How many times do we let bias dictate how we treat others? This story isn't just about one person's mistake. It's about how often this happens in the real world, at work, in stores, in schools, everywhere. Next time you catch yourself making an assumption about someone, stop. Ask yourself why. And if you're in a position to make a difference, do it. Because change doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we decide to see people for who they really are.